Report 1. My name is Richard Collins, and as I write this, I know my time is running out. The pain no longer matters as much as the urgency of sharing what I've lived through. My life was marked by a night of horror that I could never fully understand, until now. And now, the truth must come out, even if it costs me everything. Josh Miller wasn't like the other boys his age. At 16, he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders, working hard at any odd job he could find, from mowing lawns to painting fences, just to put food on the table for his mother and 2 younger siblings. Every time I saw him, he was always looking for an opportunity, always with that look in his eyes as if he was carrying more than any young person should. That morning, when I met him on the way. Before we continue with more terrifying revelations, I need you to do something crucial. Subscribe to the channel now and leave your like, or else the shadows of the night may follow you. Don't underestimate the power of the unknown. By ignoring this warning, you could become the next target of the stories we share here. Comment below which city you're watching from so we can see how far our dark tales are spreading. Your interaction is the only thing keeping us safe. And maybe you too. To the bait shop, he seemed especially hopeful, as if he expected I had something that could help ease the burden that never seemed to leave his shoulders. Josh's story was one that would send chills down anyone's spine, even though he didn't talk about it often. His father, David Miller, had disappeared exactly 6 years ago. One night, he simply didn't come home. The family lived in a small house on the outskirts of town, near a dense forest that, during the day, seemed peaceful, but at night transformed into a place cloaked in an eerie silence. That night, David had gone out for a walk, something he often did when work and life in general became too overwhelming. He always came back a few hours later, tired but rejuvenated from the time spent in nature. But that night was different. Josh always told how, that night, his mother noticed something strange. It was around 11 p.m. when she heard odd sounds coming from the forest. A deep, constant hum, followed by flickering lights between the trees. They were white, bluish lights that danced in the sky, coming and going in a disturbing rhythm. She looked out the kitchen window, trying to figure out what was happening, but she didn't dare step outside. There was a sense that something terrible, was lurking in those woods. David never returned. The police organized searches for days. The community banded together, sweeping through the forest in long walks, but they found nothing. No clues, no signs, as if David Miller had vanished into thin air. It was as though the forest had swallowed him whole, along with the mysteries it held. The officer suggested he might have run away or had an accident and gotten lost, but Josh always believed there was more to the story. He had heard the same humming sounds and seen the same lights his mother had, at the exact moment his father disappeared. However, there were never any answers, just endless questions. The disappearance of his father transformed Josh's life. He had to grow up far too quickly, becoming the man of the house when he was still just a child. Every time I saw him, he seemed to carry that shadow, that unresolved mystery of where his father might be. And whenever he spoke about the forest or the lights, his voice would drop as if he was sharing a secret that shouldn't be said out loud. There was something about that family, a cloud of tragedy and mystery that had surrounded them since that night. Many in the town avoided talking about what happened to David, but Josh never gave up searching for answers. Perhaps it was this search that made him accept my invitation to go fishing that night. Maybe in some way, he thought that being near the water, far from the forest, he could finally find some peace. But something told me that Josh knew more than he was letting on, that he suspected what happened to his father on that night of lights and humming was somehow connected to what awaited us. It was impossible not to feel the chill down my spine as I heard this story, especially remembering how Josh's eyes would fix on something distant, as if in his mind, he was still trapped in that fateful night. But something inside me made me stop and think. I invited him to join us on our fishing trip. He seemed surprised, but the joy on his face was immediate. He had never fished before, and I decided it was an opportunity to teach him something new. We set the fishing trip for October 14th, a Thursday. The day arrived with a clear sky and a light breeze, a perfect night for what was supposed to be a simple fishing adventure. When Josh showed up at my door, he was punctual as always, with a backpack slung over his shoulders and a smile that lit up the night. I handed him a gift, a fishing vest with his name embroidered on it. He could hardly believe it was for him. We loaded the car with all the gear, double-checking to make sure we hadn't forgotten anything. We headed to the Hudson River, a spot I had frequented since my youth. Everything seemed normal until nightfall, when the river remained eerily still. No fish were biting, something unusual for that place. The silence wasn't just the absence of sound, it was something deeper, more unsettling. And then we heard it. It wasn't a common sound. It wasn't the wind rustling the leaves or the calm water lapping the shore. It was a hum, low at first, almost like a whisper. But it quickly intensified, coming from all directions at once, as if the very air around us was vibrating. I felt my ears begin to throb with the growing noise, a strange pressure building in my head, like something was closing in on us, invisible but inevitable. The world seemed to stop in that moment. Time slowed down, and the deep silence of the night became a prison. I could feel my own heartbeat, each pulse echoing in my throat, as if it were trying to escape from my chest. I looked at Josh, waiting for him to say something, anything, but he was frozen in place too, his eyes wide and fixed on the horizon, as if he was seeing something I couldn't yet. And then I saw it. The lights. They were blue bright, but with a hue I had never seen before, almost as if they were made of pure energy. They pulsed, moving between the trees on the opposite bank of the river, fast, precise. But what scared me the most wasn't the speed or intensity of the lights. It was how they seemed aware, as if they knew exactly where we were and were slowly, deliberately approaching. I tried to speak, to shout to Josh, but my voice wouldn't come out. I was paralyzed, not just by fear, but as if the very air around us had grown thicker, heavier, preventing me from moving or thinking clearly. Everything around me seemed to slow down even further. The river, which had once flowed calmly, began to ripple in a strange way, undulating in a manner that made no sense, as if something enormous was moving just beneath the surface, something the water couldn't hide. The humming grew louder, becoming almost unbearable. It was as if it was resonating inside my bones, making my head throb with a dull pain. And then, one of the lights broke away from the others. It separated, like a predator choosing its prey, and began moving toward us. Not erratically, but with purpose. Every inch it got closer seemed to intensify the feeling that something was about to happen, something beyond my understanding. It was then that I looked at Josh. He was completely still, like a statue. His eyes were fixed on the light, unblinking, unreacting. It was as if he were hypnotized, trapped in that moment, unable to escape. I tried to call his name, my throat dry and tight, but he didn't hear me. His eyes were glazed, as if his entire soul was being sucked into that light. Fear started to overwhelm me, and I knew we needed to get out of there. We had to run. I ran to the car. My hands were shaking so much I could barely hold the keys. I shoved them into the ignition and turned it, once, twice, 3 times. Nothing. Just the dry, terrible sound of an empty click. The engine wouldn't start. Panic consumed me. It was as if everything around us was against us, as if we were being hunted by something far beyond our comprehension. The humming was now so loud I could hardly think, a sound that penetrated my mind like a nightmare come to life. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that made me freeze. Josh wasn't on the ground anymore. He was floating. Slowly, his body began to lift off the ground, as if invisible hands had grabbed him by the shoulders and were raising him into the air. His arms hung limply at his sides, his head tilted back, his eyes completely white. He floated without resistance, without struggle, as if he were in a trance, as if he had been taken from us by a force I couldn't see or understand. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. My mind screamed, but my body wouldn't react. Everything seemed out of control. The humming intensified even more, and the light grew brighter, hotter, burning my skin from a distance. I wanted to run, I wanted to flee, but I couldn't. I was trapped in that moment, trapped in the horror unfolding before me. Josh floated higher and higher, his body light as a feather, being pulled toward the sky. The light enveloped him, and for a moment, everything around me turned white. I closed my eyes, trying to shield myself, but the sound, the sensation that something terrible was happening, wouldn't leave me. It was as if time itself had broken, and the world around us was falling apart. And then, everything went dark. When I opened my eyes again, the light was gone, and Josh was no longer there. Before I could scream, A blinding light surrounded me. Everything turned white, and pain exploded in my head. When I opened my eyes again, I didn't know where I was. The first thing I felt was the cold of the asphalt against my bare skin. I was lying on the side of a road, without clothes, with no clear memory of what had happened. A car passed by and stopped. The driver, shocked at seeing me, called for help. When I was taken to the hospital, confusion and fear still hung over me like a dense, impenetrable fog. Everything seemed surreal, as if I were trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake from. My body was exhausted, my mind a mess, but what disturbed me the most was the emptiness I felt, like a part of me had been ripped away. Shortly after being placed on a stretcher, doctors and nurses rushed around me, their voices distant, as if they were speaking through a long tunnel. The questions came from all directions. My name, how I had gotten there, what I remembered. But what could I say? What had really happened? All my mind allowed me to access were fragments. The bright lights, the deafening hum, Josh's face, floating, and then, nothing. Just darkness. It was while they were preparing me for a series of tests that the nurse adjusting my clothes made a comment that froze my blood. She asked me how I felt after being missing for 2 weeks. 2 weeks? My mind spun, unable to comprehend what she was saying. 2 weeks? How was that possible? For me, it had been one night, one single night of horror, but somehow time had warped. What had felt like only a few hours had turned into days lost. Days I couldn't remember no matter how hard I tried. The shock intensified when a doctor, with a grave and tired expression, approached me and told me that Josh had also been found. My heart stopped for a moment. Relief mixed with fear. Josh was alive, but the doctor's words, heavy and cautious, made it clear that something was very wrong. Josh had been found in much worse condition. He wasn't speaking. He wasn't moving. He was in a catatonic state, trapped in some kind of trance, as if his mind had been completely wiped or taken to some distant, unreachable place. The doctor continued explaining, but his words became a blur to me. My thoughts kept circling around the same incessant question: what happened to us? No one could understand what had occurred. Our clothes were found exactly where we had been by the river, our fishing gear left untouched. But we had simply disappeared for 2 weeks, as if we had been ripped from reality and then returned, or maybe only part of us had been returned. The feeling that something was terribly wrong inside me grew stronger by the second. The world around me seemed unreal. Every sound, every movement was distant, as if I were seeing everything through a distorted lens. Time seemed to have a different meaning now, as if it could be bent, stretched, and manipulated by the invisible hands that had touched us that night. But no matter how hard the doctors tried to examine me and reassure me, I knew the answer to what had happened wasn't there, in any test or diagnosis. It was in the lights. It was in the humming that still echoed in my mind. And it was in Josh, trapped in a state of complete absence, as if he knew what had happened but wasn't able to come back and tell us. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes, lights, faceless shapes, voices that didn't belong to this world. The hum still vibrated in my ears, reminding me that whatever it was still out there waiting. Days after being released from the hospital, the unease wouldn't leave me. Every time I closed my eyes, the images from that night came back in disordered flashes. Lights, hums, something wrong. I needed to find Josh. He was the only person who might help me understand what happened to us that night. I searched for him relentlessly, called his house, left messages, but silence was the only answer. Until one day, I decided to go in person. When I arrived at his house, the scene was desolate. The small wooden house seemed darker than I remembered, surrounded by an oppressive feeling. I knocked on the door, and after a long wait, Josh finally answered. But the boy standing in front of me wasn't the same one I knew. His eyes, once bright with enthusiasm, were now dull, sunken, and surrounded by deep dark circles. His body trembled, not from the cold, but from fear, a fear so deep it was almost tangible. His hands shook uncontrollably, and his pale skin was covered in sweat. "Josh, what happened that night?" I asked, trying to break the silence that seemed to swallow the air around us. He didn't respond immediately. He just stared at the floor, his trembling hands clenching into fists. His words came in disconnected whispers, fragments of a mind on the brink of collapse. He mumbled something about them. They did things to us, Richard. Things no one would believe. We're not the same. They messed with us in a way we can't undo. The way he spoke about them sent chills down my spine. Who were they? Josh seemed convinced that since that night, something inside us had changed. Something we couldn't see but that was present in every cell of our bodies. He spoke as if he were being watched, constantly glancing over his shoulder, as if something or someone could appear at any moment. His eyes were always restless, as if they were chasing invisible shadows, and his words carried a desperation I had never seen before. I tried to understand, but the more he talked, the more I realized that Josh was sinking into an abyss of fear and paranoia. He mentioned experiments, something about bodies being opened and examined while still alive, voices speaking in a language he couldn't understand, and the feeling of being controlled like a puppet, with no control over his own body. He believed something had been implanted in him, something that now controlled him in ways he could barely describe. I can't anymore. They won't stop, Richard. They come at night. They come when I'm asleep. I can't escape. They always come back. His words hit me like a punch in the stomach. Something more than simple terror was consuming Josh, something much bigger. It was devouring him from the inside out. I couldn't get anything clear from our conversation, but one thing was certain. Josh was convinced that we were being monitored, that our lives had been in danger ever since that night. A few days after that conversation, I received the worst possible news. Josh had been found dead in his home. He was surrounded by empty pill bottles, his skin as pale as the moon, his eyes eternally shut. It was ruled a suicide, but something didn't add up to me. The scene was strangely clean, as if it had been carefully arranged, almost surgically. Nothing was out of place, not even the furniture. It was as if someone had gone out of their way to erase any trace of disorder before leaving. What disturbed me the most was the note found beside his body. Simple and direct, "They're watching me. I won't let them do to me what they did to my father." That last sentence froze me. Josh's father had disappeared years before, under mysterious circumstances, and was never found. And now, Josh was dead, taken by the same inexplicable terror that surrounded his father. That simple sentence suggested that it wasn't completely, but that it was connected to forces far beyond our control. That's when I started to realize the much larger scheme we were caught up in. Every step I took to understand what happened that night seemed to lead me to an invisible wall, as if someone or something was working in the shadows to ensure the truth never came to light. Josh somehow knew this, and perhaps his death was the consequence of knowing too much. What happened to him and his father wasn't a coincidence. There was a conspiracy at play, a scheme I could barely begin to understand, but it was somehow connected to those lights and the hum that still echoed in my mind. Since then, the feeling of being watched has never left me. After Josh's death, things began to unravel in a way I could have never predicted. It was fast, almost as if someone had been waiting for that outcome. Within days, the FBI showed up in our small town. They didn't come quietly either. Black cars, men in suits and dark glasses, and questions that seemed too specific, almost as if they already knew the answers before they even asked. At first, they said it was standard procedure to investigate Josh's death, considering that his father had disappeared under mysterious circumstances years before. They wanted to know everything, every detail about what happened to me and Josh that night by the river. They asked what I remembered, what my interactions with him had been like in the days leading up to his death. But what made me most uncomfortable was the way they watched me. It wasn't just curiosity. It was like they were analyzing every word I said, every move I made, searching for something deeper, something I didn't even know. At first, I thought it was just a routine investigation, but then the questions started to change. They wanted to know about the lights. They wanted details about the hum Josh and I had heard. One of the agents, a man named Anderson, seemed particularly interested in my dreams, which I found strange. He repeatedly asked if I was having nightmares, if I felt like I was being watched or followed. That unsettled me. I began to realize that the FBI wasn't just interested in Josh's death. They were interested in me. In that night. In those lights. The days that followed were worse than any nightmare. I couldn't sleep anymore. Every time I closed my eyes, it was like I was transported back to that night, to that moment when Josh floated in the air. And worse, I started dreaming that I was being abducted too. In the dream, I felt my body being pulled upward, as if an invisible force was dragging me out of reality, into a cold and empty place. I was lying on a metallic table, surrounded by shadows, figures whispering in a language I couldn't understand, while something was being implanted in me, something I couldn't see, but I could feel it pulsing under my skin. I always woke up the same way, gasping, drenched in sweat, with a certainty that I wasn't alone. Fear consumed me. Even during the day, I felt like I was being watched. It wasn't common paranoia. It was a constant sensation, like something or someone was keeping a close eye on me. On the streets, at the store, even in my own house, I'd see shadows out of the corner of my eye, figures that disappeared the moment I tried to focus on them. I started locking all the doors and windows, even though I knew it wouldn't make a difference. Something was out there, and it was following me. Worse still, the visits from the federal agents continued. They never said much, but they showed up regularly, always with more questions, always wanting to know more about what I was feeling, as if they were waiting for something to change. I started to realize that somehow they already knew about my nightmares, about the shadows, about the feeling of being watched. It seemed like every word I said confirmed something for them. But what? They never told me. I remember one particular night when everything became unbearable. I was at home, sitting in the living room with the lights off. The silence was almost deafening, and I could feel that familiar pressure in the air. That's when I saw it. In the reflection of the window, for just a brief moment, I saw a figure standing behind me. It wasn't human, it had no defined form, but I knew it was there. When I turned to look, there was nothing. Just the empty room and the muffled sound of my own heart beating. Was I going crazy? Or was this what they wanted me to believe? The more time passed, the more I felt like the FBI was closing in on me. Every move I made seemed to be monitored. Sometimes when I left my house, I'd see cars parked on the street, always the same ones, with the same men in suits inside. They never did anything, never spoke to me, but I knew they were there for me. I started avoiding sleep. The thought of closing my eyes and going back to that place, to those dreams, was unbearable. But eventually, exhaustion always won, and when I did sleep, the nightmares came back with more intensity. Always the same feeling, the hum, the lights, my body being pulled upward, and those voices whispering around me. The worst part was waking up and realizing that the dreams were starting to blend with reality. Some nights, I would wake up outside of my bed, on the living room floor or near the front door, as if I had been trying to escape from something. Other times, I woke up with strange marks on my body, small bruises, scratches, marks I couldn't explain. I began to wonder if what happened to Josh and his father was, somehow, happening to me too. Maybe that's why the FBI was so interested. Maybe they knew more than they were letting on. Maybe they knew that we had been taken. That something had been done to us. And now, the same thing that destroyed Josh was coming for me. I wanted to run, to disappear, but I knew it wouldn't matter. You can't escape something that's always lurking, something that doesn't belong to this world. The only thing left was the truth. Report 2. I cannot say my name. I can't reveal who I am, where I am, or any detail that could identify me. The only thing I can do is tell my story, because soon, I may not have the chance anymore. And maybe, you who are reading this will understand that everything we live, everything we think is safe, is an illusion. The government knows. They've always known. It all started about 2 years ago when I landed my dream job as a press secretary at the White House. It was an opportunity one never imagined achieving so early in my career, and I accepted it without hesitation. I was only 28, full of ambition, and open-minded to everything the world had to offer. It seemed like the beginning of a promising new phase, but little did I know, that choice would change my life forever. Soon after starting the position, I was informed that all senior-level staff participated in a weekly therapeutic program. At first, it seemed harmless, group hypnosis sessions, supposedly to relieve the stress of working in such an intense environment. They said it was for our own good, a way to ensure we stayed focused and balanced. We were told the sessions were completely safe and voluntary, But somehow, refusing never felt like an option. The sessions were strange. At first, I didn't feel anything out of the ordinary. Just a mild sense of deep relaxation, like my body was floating, while I listened to the therapist's soothing voice guiding us through a collective meditation. But after a few months, I started to feel something different, something that shouldn't have been there. It was as if, during these sessions, I wasn't just relaxing. I was being monitored and manipulated. The dreams started soon after. Strange, disturbing dreams, where I found myself lying on a cold metal table, surrounded by bright lights and shapes that weren't human. I felt a presence, something ancient and powerful, but I couldn't see their faces. Every time I tried to focus on the details, the images distorted. But there was one thing I always remembered clearly: an intense pressure in my abdomen. That's when everything began to fall apart, and I discovered something that left me in absolute shock. I was pregnant. 3 weeks. Something that for most people would be a mix of surprise and joy, but for me, it was a cruel blow of reality. I wasn't in a relationship, I lived alone, and there was no rational explanation for it. It shouldn't have been possible. But there it was, the pregnancy test confirming the impossible. From the moment I received the news, a disturbing feeling took hold of me. It was as if that baby, growing inside me, wasn't entirely mine. With each passing day, I felt a deep discomfort, a strange presence in my womb. It wasn't the maternal bond that so many women describe. It was something darker. It was as if a shadow was developing, something growing silently, leaving no trace, but I knew it was there watching. Sometimes I felt faint movements, and although it was far too early for that, I had the constant feeling that I wasn't alone.